I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. A fast-growing state, lagging incomes, and a limited supply of developable land created a housing affordability crisis in Nevada before the pandemic hit. But COVID-19 and its far-reaching impacts on the supply chain put fuel on the fire, so to speak, exacerbating the issues that were already plaguing Nevada renters and people trying to buy a home. Now, affordable housing seems farther and farther from reach for average Nevadans. Local and state leaders have tried to use the levers of power to boost supply and lower costs. And while there has been some progress in certain areas, I think we can all agree we are not out of the woods yet. What's it going to take to put Nevada on a sustainable path to affordable housing for the foreseeable future? Are leaders pushing the right buttons or advancing limited solutions that may take years to be implemented and even longer to be felt? The nonpartisan Guinn Center recently released the report on housing affordability in Nevada, a 122-page deep dive on all of those questions and so much more. This episode, the Guinn Center's executive director, Jill Tolles, and one of the authors, Dr. Nic Irwin, joined me to dive into this report and give us some interesting insights. It's perhaps the issue that touches every single Nevadan, and I learned so much talking to Jill and Nic. I think you will too. The Guinn Center joining me on the podcast this week. Thrilled to be with Jill Tolles, the executive director, and Nic Irwin with the lead center for real estate at UNLV. Jill and Nic, thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us, Ben. And we're big fans of your show and appreciate you bringing this important topic to the audience.
Absolutely. So for people who might not know, the Guinn Center, nonpartisan policy think tank that Jill has been running for a few years now. We go way back to the Nevada legislature in, 2017, 2019 sessions. I forget exactly. I lectured at one of her classes, and her daughter's probably off traveling with my cousin somewhere because that's how small this world is here in Reno. So appreciate you getting you on, Jill. I know last time with the Guinn Center, we got Christine and I believe it was Michael, but now we got the executive director. We appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did you guys want to look into affordable housing? I mean, I think it kind of goes without saying, obviously, because housing affects every single one of us in Nevada. But why and when did you guys want to do this deep dive in this report that we're going to talk about today?
For those who don't know about the Guinn Center, we are a statewide nonpartisan policy research center. As you said, we're affiliated with the University of Nevada, Reno. But as you'll find out today, we have very strong relationships with our academic partners at UNLV and Boyd School of Law. And we study 5 main pillars of policy areas: education, health and social policy, economic and fiscal policy, some natural land and resources in the past, and then governance and elections. And so every interim, we ask the public, we ask our board, our advisory council, and we watch the news to find out what are the most important pressing issues that we want to study in each of those categories. And time again, when we looked at our economic and fiscal policy pillar, housing affordability continued to rise to the top. And as the report showed, over half of our renters are excessively burdened in the state. And really due to population growth, exponential population growth, 70 consecutive years of being the fastest growing state in the nation up through 2010. And so that, combined with 2 major pauses on development due to the Great Recession and to COVID, put us in a situation where we really are once again finding ourselves at the bottom of states in terms of housing affordability. And so we wanted to take a look at what got us here, what were those causes, how bad is it in what areas, and then offer a series of policy options to the legislature and the governor to consider that we're really proud to say are bipartisan and nonpartisan in nature. You have the governor and top legislative leadership on both sides of the aisle talking about how incredibly important this issue is.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to that stat that you referenced, which was, we all know it and we see the growth. Nevada's been among the fastest growing states now for decades. But just to reemphasize this, from 1940 to 2010, Nevada led the nation in growth 70 consecutive years. That's a stat that just blows my mind, and slowed down perhaps just a little bit. We're not the fastest, but we're still growing quickly. And so that's kind of how we got here. Nic, a question for you. I mean, is this really primarily, would you say, a supply side issue, a demand side issue with all the population growth that we're seeing? Obviously, it's, probably a little bit of both, but what's really driving this?
I mean, you said it there. It's a little bit of both. It's that demand is from our population, people moving here, putting pressure on housing prices. That's going to push up housing prices, and developers respond to that incentive. But when supply prevents those developers from fully responding for any of these frictions we have, permitting and zoning and federal lands, all those things impact our ability to supply the houses we need. So what we see, the people are looking for, they're seeing their rents go up year after year. They're seeing the cost of buying a house going up year over year. It's because so many people want to move here because it's a great state to live in, both in the north and the south part of Nevada. We're facing the same issues. People move in, and we just can't build enough houses quickly enough to account for this increased demand.
Yeah, my sense would be with all the population growth that we have seen and the things that are limiting the supply of housing, that even if we didn't have the two pauses that you mentioned, Jill, with the Great Recession and then more recently the COVID-19 pandemic, we would probably still have some sort of affordable housing crisis. But why don't you guys talk about how much, especially recently with the COVID pandemic, that, as far as I see it, exacerbated the issues that we would have already kind of had regardless, and just kind of put fuel on the fire to make this problem even worse.
It's really, I think COVID has really sort of put in stark contrast the issues that the state faces, because it hit all of us, really quickly, because so much of our state is dependent on hospitality and tourism. When we had the COVID shutdowns, we saw our unemployment rates go up, 40% spikes, at least down here in Southern Nevada. But it made more people aware of what was going on in the housing market. And then subsequently after that, since it was still a pretty low interest rate environment for mortgages, we had a lot of people moving here because they could do remote work from especially places in California. And to put it in perspective, if you sell a house in California, even a house that needs a lot of work, you're going to come in with a lot of cash on hand, and you're going to be able to make an all cash offer that's going to potentially outcompete the locals here. And that's really tough. A lot of our folks are working in jobs that may not be as high paying as those folks moving in. They're doing remote work. Just puts them at a disadvantage. And it's really, really tough. And I think it matters so much to us now because it's within recent memory. A lot of folks remember you could afford a nice brand new house on the current salary, because even before the run up before the housing crash, house prices were high, but incomes, were keeping up for a while until we sort of hit the big takeoff there. And when it came back down, housing was pretty affordable. 2014, housing was pretty affordable, but we're talking within 10 years, housing became affordable to the vast, middle swath of our population, to something that making that transition from being a renter to a homeowner, it might be on some people's means right now. And that's the issue we need to address.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Before we get into the real meat of this study, Jill, I wanted to ask you about, the study comes out at an interesting time, right, where we're seeing kind of a disturbance, a decline in the stock market, and there's some economic challenges in the country at large. People are worried that there may be possibility for a recession and things like that. And naturally, if that were to happen, the housing market would really slow down. And I saw even just recently a headline today, I think in Reno, that the vacancy rate for apartments is, at the highest that it's been in a little while. And so I just want to know how you think about this report coming out, and yet potentially we don't know where this is going with the national economy potentially slowing down our housing market, or maybe not.
Sure. Well, I think you tackled a number of things there. And for me, I'm not the one doing the research, but I certainly am a concerned citizen, even as the executive director of this center, of reading the research. And I was also really struck reading the research just how income levels have not kept up with the demand. And so you're speaking to a lot of that side of the equation. What happens if we enter into another recession, or with potentially unemployment going back up? What happens to displaced federal workers? And what kind of burden that's going to put on the economy and their ability to afford housing. I think you bring up also a really interesting point about Northern Nevada. And we know that there are some regional differences between Northern Nevada and Southern Nevada and the rurals in regards to how they have addressed tackling the affordable housing equation. And a lot of the recommendations in this report in regards to streamlining regulations, permitting processes, creating more zoning for multifamily housing is something that Northern Nevada has been on top of for some time now. And so when I read that headline this morning, the question that I would probably pose to Nic would be how much of that is really the impacts of Northern Nevada, Reno and Sparks in particular, taking a lot of those initiatives that they can do at the local level and don't require legislative action to put into place today. So the last thing that I'll say in regards to things happening since we put out this report, there's obviously a lot of conversation around tariffs, not just conversation, but action.
Yeah.
And so what kind of strain is that going to put on construction costs is something that is not covered in this report. It was finished before that time, but it's certainly something that shows what a fluid environment this is. I still stand behind, though, the policy options in the report are not contingent upon those economic factors that we talked about.
It's the great unknown. This is sort of uncharted territory for a lot of businesses. And it's anything that tariffs are taxes, first of all, but they generate a lot of economic uncertainty. And if you're thinking about a developer planning out their next 12, 18, 24 months of where you want to build, knowing where the cost of raw materials and how those are going to be, that enables you to pencil in projects. And we may see some projects, especially projects that may be targeted towards, not quite, affordable housing as we normally define it, or lower income housing, with that middle, where they don't receive any other support. We can see a lot of those projects, maybe they just are not feasible anymore, with uncertainties with what are the raw material costs going to be. And another issue we're facing here in Southern Nevada is, there's Southern California is going to be rebuilding after those wildfires for some time. Mm-hmm. And there are some significant wage differentials between wage. If you're, a construction worker, you could potentially go to Southern California and make a little bit more money. And that could be very attractive for some folks as well. So that's just going to put added pressure on some of our, talented construction folks. Are going to be potentially relocating temporarily to work. That just means fewer people. And that means the costs are going to go up for each of those, remaining crews. And all these things, they factor into making in the short term projects potentially more expensive. But tackling housing, it's a long run issue. It's a long run nonpartisan issue. Affordable housing doesn't care who you voted for in the last election. Affordable housing impacts us all. And with what we do today and the next couple weeks at the legislature can really set the tone for the next 3, 5, 10 years of what the state's going to look like and how affordable it can be. For those people we know will keep on moving here.
I'll add to that, if I can, that we're second lowest in the nation in apprentices for construction apprentices per 1,000 construction workers. So wow. It's also a workforce pipeline issue as well. And so we have to be looking at this from a multifaceted approach. And like Nic said, not just for today, we might see a little bit of an ebb and flow like you just observed in today's headlines, but knowing that there's been decades that got us to this point, we're not going to get out in just one month, 1 year, even one legislative cycle. And dealing with everything from workforce to construction costs to making it more affordable to get that supply to zoning issues are all part of that solution.
Before we get into some of those solutions, I glossed over one thing that I think is critical when talking about all this, and it makes Nevada, from my perspective, so unique compared to so many other states, which is, we've been described, especially up in northern Nevada, but in southern Nevada too, is kind of landlocked because we're surrounded by so much federal land. Nic, how much does that really constrain us? I've heard the line from the mayor of Sparks, Ed Lawson, basically saying, the land to the east of us might as well be water because we can't do anything on it. And whereas so many other communities might be able to expand out into create more suburbs, essentially on the fringes of their community, we don't really have the ability to do that.
You hit the nail on the head there. That's really true. It's the federal government owns over 80% of our state. It's an enormous amount of land, and it's not equally spread throughout. There are some counties that have far less land, federally owned land. There are some counties that have a lot. Poor Lincoln County, looking at over 97% of that land is owned by the federal government. That constrains where we can build. Here in Clark County, it's an issue as well, especially with the shape of the Las Vegas Valley. It's an issue as well because it constrains our ability to build. We're sort of limited to where we can build, and we're starting to build on some reclaimed land as well. And in northern Nevada, they face these same issues as well. I think Washoe has a majority of it is federally owned as well. And it's difficult because talking to a developer here, if you can think about demand is instantaneous. We have people moving in every day. I tell my students this in class. There's a really interesting thing you can do is you can look at the price of getting a rental truck from, let's say, Beverly Hills. This is the example I've used recently. Beverly Hills to Las Vegas, a U-Haul truck, a one-way, is a lot cheaper than if you were taking that same truck going from Las Vegas to Beverly Hills. That's because, there's so much demand to move into Nevada, and that demand is happening every day, but supply takes a lot longer to respond. And from talking to developers down south, it's about 5 years from when those federal parcels are identified to when they are, sold at auction, infrastructure's in place, people can actually walk in the front door. We're talking 5 years. So that if you think about how that constrains our ability to respond to this land issue, if we can build everything now that we currently have in our holster, so to speak, we'll basically address the demand now, but that's not accounting for any of the demand that's going to rise in the interim for that population. And that's why it's so tricky. And that's why a lot of the states that have really done a good job of dealing with this, places like Texas, they've removed a lot of these hurdles and barriers that allow developers to build more quickly. They streamline their zoning and permitting processes, which have helped. Things have gotten more unaffordable in a lot of places across the U.S., but a lot of these other states, especially in the South, have really made a concerted effort to make things as affordable as possible, which is why you can see that I like to look at it every 4 years when the presidential election happens. You can see that shift in electoral votes because population is increasing in all these states.
Absolutely.
Part of that is from the housing market.
For sure. Texas, I think, set to get another handful of seats in Congress in the next census because of trends exactly like that. So you guys' report lists, I think, 10 or 15 different solutions that could be implemented at the state, local, federal levels. But I'm not going to mention every single one of those. What's one policy, although it probably is going to take many of them, but what's, maybe the one that could be enacted the quickest, that would have the most impact right away, that you look at all these things and say, if Southern Nevada and Northern Nevada elected officials did X, we would feel this the soonest?
Man, can a time machine help so we can go back in time and fix these issues? I think, it's one of the things that there are so many little pieces that a lot of them compound on each other. So if you can streamline zoning and make it easier to build housing everywhere, all types of housing, not just single family housing, and you also make it easier for permitting to happen as well, that can sort of compound each other. So think of the synergies of this happening. It's easier to build if you get zoning by right, if you allow projects to go, because they are, they're not going to be voted down by a zoning board that may not like, the aesthetics of the project. As long as it's based on zoning and based on the what's required by statute, by code, and you allow it to be built more quickly, you can start to convert that land over and develop it and put more houses on for people to live in. Those are both tremendously helpful things, and they work in really well. This is going to be popular, I know, but parking is a touchy subject, especially in Southern Nevada, because we still remember the free parking at most casinos, which is no longer free most places. But people really love having free parking, but it's wasted space often. It's space that could have units on it, and that would really, really help us put more units per square foot on that land. But then partner with that, if you want to eliminate parking requirements, then you have to have better public transportation as well. So a lot of these things are all like interrelated, and it's not just the housing. When we're thinking about housing, it's a transportation issue as well. It's an infrastructure issue. It's a water issue down south. I mean, all of these things are interrelated, but at the end of the day, it's finding a way to address them to meet that demand, because people keep wanting to move here, and we want more people to move here. It helps diversify our economy. We bring new people in. That's great, but it's these little things, these compounding little things. If you sort of pull them all together, then they'll have a big effect in the future.
I know it's probably hard to speak in generalizations, but I'm going to ask you to, which is, has Southern Nevada or Northern Nevada, broadly speaking, done a better job at implementing many of the policies, solutions that you guys list in this report, and has it made an impact?
Well, I think we've seen more movement in Northern Nevada, but I'll let my Southern Nevada colleague debate me on that, just in terms of more of that, those zoning changes that needed to be made to allow for more of that missing middle multifamily construction. So I think we see it in the numbers that the burden is higher in Southern Nevada, and that hasn't moved as quickly.
I would agree. I think Northern Nevada, just from zoning alone, they permit multifamily housing in a much wider swath of Northern Nevada than we do down south. We've sort of we've allowed it along our big industrial, our big sort of corridors around major transportation networks, through around 215 and up 15 and Charleston and places like that, but not a lot of multifamily housing in between there. Northern Nevada is much more permissive, which is great. That's one of the reasons why I think maybe rents are falling. Maybe there's so much vacancy is because you build a lot of units, and it's easier to build units in Northern Nevada because the folks in Washoe and Reno, and they've really made a concerted effort to make sure things are affordable, much more so than it's a much more diffuse issue down here because we have so many different players in the game. And I think Northern Nevada has really come together in a way that's been really, really helpful, at least in terms of zoning alone. And that's great, because that will help put downward pressure on those prices.
Yeah, from your perspective, why hasn't Southern Nevada taken, as elected officials, have they not taken as active of a role in implementing some of these policies? Because I imagine they're facing the similar pressure from their constituents who are facing the exact same high rents, high housing prices that we are up here in the north.
That's great. I'm going to refer everyone. There's a really good book that came out. It's called On the Housing Crisis by Drutham Desmus from The Atlantic. It's a companion of some of her essays that she's done on housing. And I think one of the things she points out in the book is something that happens in Southern Nevada. Everyone knows housing is an issue, but it's a regional issue. And every, say city council person, they know that they need more affordable units. They need more units of housing in their locality, but they may not be willing to sort of make the changes there, hoping that someone else will. But so say Henderson decides not to, well, that'll be fine, because then Clark County, unincorporated Clark County, or North Las Vegas or Las Vegas will do it. But if North Las Vegas says, well, we'll just wait for someone else, or if Las Vegas says, and then we're waiting on unincorporated Clark County, so there's no coordination. When the housing market, we think about it happening, we live in specific cities, but really we live in a broad metropolitan area, and it's the combined effects of all these different municipalities and the county itself that are increasing that supply over time. So if not everyone is sort of putting forth their full best effort into it, by lack of coordination or sort of lack of interest, then that can be a real problem. And this is why some states have, removed some of this power away from localities to make some of these zoning decisions and moved them to the state level. because a state legislature, they care about the entire state. I mean, that's why they're elected. And their constituents are much broader than someone living in a Henderson or Clark County or Las Vegas. And so that's one of the big issues we're facing. It's coordination. Everyone knows it's an issue. It's just not quite sure what they can do. And
wanted to ask you guys too about a policy solution that is not mentioned as one that should be implemented, which is rent control. We hear it a lot. I've seen commercials on the airwaves right now from some folks saying why rent control is not going to work. And your report essentially says as much. I'll read from it and quote from it here. Rent control can distort and create inefficiencies in the market by limiting movement among renters and disincentivizing landlord investment in both new and existing units. Because I think it's often thought as a really quick and easy way, just cap the amount of rent that can be charged for people, and that's going to help immediately. You guys at least don't see it that way. How come?
First of all, one caveat about this report, it looked at housing affordability and an economic analysis. It did not look at housing stability. So that was one of the limitations of the scope of work, of what we were called upon to do. So you also see that there's nothing about the eviction process, which is another topic that gets a lot of attention at the legislature. But the charge of the study was to look at the economic analysis of housing affordability overall, not just for specific subsets of the population, but also just for the whole of Nevada. How do we make sure that housing is more affordable, and taking into consideration the circumstances that got us to where we are today, as well as the burdens that we see being just the most excessively cost burden in the nation. And so, or half of our residents being excessively cost burdened for rent. And so, and as an economic equation, the research team just found that you may be able to help one subset of the population, but it may pit you against another subset. So if you are giving that as a solution to veterans, for example, then are you then disadvantaging or raising the cost for single moms? And so it came down to basic math.
That's a great way to think about it. I mean, if we're thinking about housing affordability is defined on multiple levels, it's renters as well, but it's homeowners being able to afford that first house. And rent control only helps a small subset of the population of those folks that are in those units. When what we should be doing, I mean, homeowners are still the majority of folks in any market. 60 to 65% of houses are owned by people who live in them. That means that, if we understand too, to more perspective on this, that, homeownership is a great way to build wealth, generational wealth within families. And if we're thinking about correcting those differences and how some folks are much better off in terms of intergenerational wealth, become a homeowner is an important first step in that. Our rent control won't help those homeowners necessarily. And that potentially is an issue. There's some, as well, unintended consequences from it. It's one of the things that kind of sounds good until you sort of see how they play out. It can create a lot of underinvestment in buildings, where if a developer or say a property manager, once people are in, if they know that they can only get charged so much for rent, then they may underinvest in it. And that is what economic research has shown, especially at these old rent control places on the East Coast. A lot of the rent control buildings tend to be in much worse shape and more likely to be condemned in the future than ones that weren't. But now, obviously, there needs to be ways to address, especially people who are very low income, address them as well. But there are other assorted programs that help that, like LIHTC and Section 8 vouchers and all those sort of things as well. That's another sort of area too, if you're thinking about affordability beyond just rent control, because of the issues of rent control is making sure our numbers for our Section 8 vouchers are better matched to sort of what our state needs are. To put in perspective, in a Southern Nevada perspective, we have about the same population as Chicago, the entire Chicagoland MSA. But we get I think it's a third the number of vouchers, which is just based on old funding formulas that don't account for how rapidly growing we are. And that those create additional drags as well. So addressing that issue, which again is a federal issue, tougher for state legislators to address, but a united front can be something that can definitely help. And I think especially the current administration is really trying to prioritize I think helping states address these issues as best they can. That's certainly something that I think we can look into and sort of advocate to HUD Secretary Turner on our state's behalf to make sure we're getting our fair share.
As we wrap it up here, this is a politics show, so I want to bring it back to politics a little bit. And Jill, I'll have you take off your nonpartisan policy hat, put on your used to be an assembly member hat, and tell me, what policies in here might have been implemented already, if not for the political implications. I mean, obviously, full well you're accountable to your constituents eventually. A lot of them, especially a lot of the ones that are motivated to speak up at city council meetings and county commission meetings and whatnot, tend to be homeowners and they're already in a house, and they probably benefit by, continuing rising home prices. And just how do you think about the political implications? Where would we be if elected officials were making these decisions based on policy alone, not politics?
First, let me say, I think politics really still has a role in the land discussion, but that's more just about how each state fights for taking priority in being able to get those bills passed on the state and on the local level. Though, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in this report is the solutions here really are, by and large, nonpartisan. They're things that the legislature and the governor could act on today. That it's true, there are definitely some different sides to how best to address these issues, particularly around the housing stability side, which again is outside of the scope of work of this particular report. But there's a lot of options here that don't need to play politics. They're not partisan in nature. I think that it's really, honestly, it's a matter of people being willing to come together and not need to own the win. I think that that's a lot of times what we see is that if it's only one party that comes up with this solution and they don't want the other party to get credit for it. And if we could move past that and say, what are some of the areas where we can collaborate and find common ground, we're going to get so much further in meeting the needs of citizens. And I'm just, again, really proud of the number of actionable solutions that were put forward by the research team to help our legislature and our governor do that.
All righty, Jill and Nic, thank you guys so much for doing this. And for our listeners too, I will put the link to the full report for people that want to go even wonkier and deeper in the weeds than this conversation today. So check out the link to the full report in the show notes. But Jill and Nic, thank you guys so much for doing this. I learned a ton. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Ben. Great to see you.
A special thanks to Jill and Nic for joining me this episode. If you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you at bjmargiott, Margiott, at sbgtv.com, and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover Ballot Battleground Nevada. Thanks for listening.